Hey everyone, welcome to the Canine Culture Podcast, where we talk about everything dog. Q&As with veterinarian professionals, rescue operators, everyday topics. We cover everything dog on this podcast. So make sure you subscribe to the Canine Culture Podcast on your favorite podcast platform, and make sure you're following us on social media on both Instagram and Facebook. Thanks again for listening. Now here's that next episode. Hey everyone, welcome to the Canine Culture Podcast. This is your host, Brittany, and today we are joined by Souha Ezzedeen. She is a dog trainer and relationship coach and the author of the Way of Life Method. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So tell us a little bit about yourself before we jump into the episode.
Yes, so about 20 years ago, I am someone who dealt with a reactive dog, went looking for solutions, and just could not find the help that we needed. And that went on for several years. I had no intention of becoming a trainer, really. I was a PhD student finishing graduate business school, on a tenure track university position. And I just wanted to share my life with dogs. And then one of these dogs happened to be extremely challenging. So I went looking for help in the same way that you went on looking for help for your dog with the cancer diagnosis. And so I went on looking, and long story short, it took a few years. And then finally I came across the teachers and the teachings that really helped me understand why dogs are reactive and how to really help them. And then it wasn't enough for me to just keep, that knowledge to myself, which I thought was groundbreaking and life-changing knowledge for me and potentially other people. And so I started my business a few years ago and wrote my book, The Way of Life Method, which summarizes this wisdom that I've accumulated over the years with this dog of mine, Maya, who was very reactive and challenging.
And that's our topic today. So understanding and helping reactive dogs. And
yes,
like you said, there's not a ton out there. And if you Google, you might not come across anything that's actually helpful. So let's talk about, and this could go a lot of different ways, but let's kind of talk about what does reactive behavior look like? And maybe it would be helpful as well to kind of merge this with what's kind of the difference between a reactive dog and an aggressive dog. And I know that could be a very fine line. So let's kind of jump into that.
Very good. So in a nutshell, I view a reactive behavior or a reactive episode as essentially a conflict situation between a human and their dog on how to respond with a fact of life. Something happens, we hear something, we see someone, we see a dog, the dog reacts a certain way, we would prefer they reacted a different way, and now we have a conflict situation. So ultimately there's an argument that's going on. The relationship is being put to the test in that moment, the relationship between the human and the dog. And that is the perspective that I take on, is the relationship perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what does that look like? Explosive body behavior, lunging, barking, pulling. But there's also, Brittany, a mental element to it, where the dog is completely fixated on the object that triggered them. They're oblivious to what we're saying. They're refusing our food. They're refusing our treats. They're not listening to what we have to say. They're taken hostage by this mental experience, by this reactive episode.
Mm-hmm.
Now, reactivity versus aggression. Yes, indeed, it is a fine line. And aggression very well is and can be a natural extension of a reactive moment where the dog has lost thought, they've lost control over their body, over their minds, and that can, depending on the dog and the situation and many other factors, escalate into aggression, where now there's an element of intention to cause harm.
Mm-hmm.
Now there's an element of wanting to hurt something or someone. as an outcome of this reactive episode.
Mm-hmm.
There's this energy that needs to come out, and it at times comes out very aggressively. So in the case of my dog, Maya, if we have a minute for me to give a very quick example, is that, yes, she was very reactive and sensitive and quick to react. But then the power that she had as a dog, combined with some of the things that I was doing in our way of life, which in hindsight now I could see how they had stressed her so much, resulted in her reactive episodes not just being reactivity, but also involving aggression, where there was harm done to dogs of our friends, several of these dogs of our friends that we were out with together. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't just reactivity for her, it also turned into aggression as well.
It's interesting you talk about how it can take over the mind and the body, because we have a reactive dog, and when he gets in those states of mind, if you will, he does essentially just completely black out. It doesn't matter if you're holding his favorite treat. It doesn't matter if you're yelling, you're clapping your hands, you're hitting the clicker, whatever it might be.
Correct.
It's almost like an inability to come unfixated, if you will.
Yes.
Whether it be over, for him, it's more often than not like a toy or food. It can be people outside, and we've kind of worked with that. But I know, especially for him, it's food and it's toys, and it's not consistent. So that's something else that's somewhat interesting with him is, maybe one day he has a toy and he doesn't care if someone else plays with it, but the next day it'll set him off.
I see.
So it's kind of that inconsistency. So,
and food, is it around the food bowl?
The food bowl, treats, even dropping an ice cube, even though we wouldn't associate that as a common
source.
Yeah. So resource guarding essentially is what that has become. And, it's hard to say with him being a rescue, is it almost like a learned behavior? Is it a behavior that he developed by virtue of how he was first raised as a puppy? For us, it's hard to tell. I know you've probably seen a number of triggers for this reactive behavior. So
yes,
I'm sure you've seen food. I'm sure you've seen toys. What are some other common triggers that you've seen?
For sure. And there are many. There are as many as any environment can present. And what is nothing for one dog can be triggering for another dog. So it could be people that are seen, dogs that are seen, sounds, which is a little bit different than just general noises. So let's say the ping of the doorbell or a microwave that can set off a dog. It can be being startled. You don't see something and now you do, and the dog that sets off a reactive episode. It could also be being touched at the vet, where there's a spot that hurts, and then that triggers an episode. Being cut at the groomers, and that triggers a reaction. So it has to do with the body. It has to do with the environment. There's all sorts of triggers, really. Yes.
So let's kind of talk about some different causes or contributing factors to reactivity. So the first one maybe to talk about could be genetic predispositions or breed tendencies. And I hate putting dogs into a box. I never say this breed is X, this breed is Y. But
for you,
yeah, I think you would agree. Sometimes, though, there are breed tendencies with things like
yes. 100%. And to deny those would be, just overlooking the power of breed and breeding, in particular ancient breeds that have been around for a long time with established tendencies, nurtured over decades, if not centuries. So definitely there's something to be said about breeds and also breeding. So within a certain breed, there could be different types of breeding, different lines, different traits that are emphasized within the same breed. So the complexity is tremendous. But I agree with you. It's not just the breed. It's breed plus other elements in the dog's way of life, right? But going back to breed, really, there are some dogs that by virtue precisely of the work that they've had to do, have had to develop a certain sensitivity that makes them quick to respond there is a connection between a dog being driven to work and being reactive, because there's drive, there's energy, there's power in that dog. And I don't care how big or small or how they look, there's a fire beneath. There's drive and energy and instinct, which sometimes, if not harnessed correctly, can, become a reactive problem, a reactivity issue. But certainly there is a genetic contribution, no doubt. Yes.
And so we start with that. So you start with the breeding component, and then, you move into early puppyhood. So socialization, early experiences. And what's your take on getting puppies acclimated or socialized and kind of those first experiences they have with the world, and preventing reactivity or not even preventing, but addressing it, if you see it early on?
Yeah. Such a powerful question. Such a good question, because this is where the way of life method takes a very different position on what socialization is and what it ought to be. And the true cause of the problems that we are facing, do they have to do with the lack of socialization or a poor understanding of what that means? I've said this many times, is that we put such an emphasis on socialization, and meanwhile, we have a rather poor understanding of what it means.
Yeah.
Of what it looks like.
Right.
Right? And so I'm not saying that there aren't critical learning periods or critical developmental periods that happen throughout the lifetime of any living being, where there's growth spurts throughout the life course. You're not just growing when you go from puppy to a grown-up. You continue to grow. We all continue to grow. And so what ends up happening is that this idea that there are critical learning periods or growth spurts or developmental periods means that you have to now slam this dog with every experience imaginable, every person, every dog, every situation, to the point of overkill. And now now we have a reactive dog. Now we have an overstimulated, exhausted dog. And it's not necessary to go at it that way. That's not how animals in nature, whom I try to emulate in my book and in my method, that's not how they socialize. They socialize gradually, mindfully, carefully. And so my book outlines a way of doing that, a way of socializing across the 6 steps, which I detail in several chapters in the book. And so, yes, of course, early experiences and socialization contribute to reactivity, but let's understand how.
Right.
Let's be clear about how. It's generally not because people have not socialized, but because they've socialized excessively.
Yeah, that makes sense. I
hope it does. Yes. It's a very important point.
We've taken socialization to mean every person, every sound, every
correct.
You have to like everything, but even
correct.
We don't like everything.
Exactly. Exactly.
So, yeah,
and not only that, if I may interject very quickly, Brittany, as humans, we're even more social than dogs. And even us being more social, and we're still rather selective. Right. It's our family, it's our friends. So now imagine this dog who has inherited a predatory nature. Even if they are pets and they're on our beds and couches, they have inherited a predatory nature where, by definition, they care about some much more than others, right? And so on top of this poor understanding of socialization is this expectation, right, that they ought to love everyone and be friendly with everyone. I cannot tell you how many messages I get of people saying, my former collie loved everybody. Why is this collie not in love with everybody?
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. And you can see how we are creating the problem right there. The problem's not in the dog, it's in our expectations.
Yeah. I face that having Pomeranians. People see small, fluffy dogs. And
yes.
I want to hold, I want to pet. And it's like, well,
yes.
they don't like that. And they're like, what? All small dogs like that. And it's like,
no,
they don't actually.
That's true.
You can't generalize in that manner.
Yeah. Well, there is something that I could comfortably say about small dogs. is that because there is that expectation that they're having to negotiate every day about whether they have that bodily autonomy, you know what I mean? Because they can be so easily grabbed and picked up and whatever, that they become even more sensitive about their bodies in a way that a larger dog would be a lot more, nonchalant about having their body handled. The little dog is a bit more careful about, excuse me, and who are you and what do you want? I have a fantastic client right now with 2 poms, 2 females, Mishka and Masha, and one of them is particular about her body being handled in a way that has required that we rethink her right to demand respect around her body, even if she's little, even if she's a lap dog and terribly cute.
Right.
So yes, there's, what the dogs bring to the table and then what our expectations are doing to create this problem.
Yeah. Yeah. Our expectations certainly say a lot, whether it be with how our dog should act or, with respect to their just general training. I think you probably see it. People are like, well, I want my dog to do ABC. I'm not going to do any extra work. We're not going to put work in at home. You're going to train the dog and that's it. And it's like, well, that's not how it works.
Right. Exactly. I say the dog will give you 10 times more than what you invest, but you have to invest. There are people that I've come across in my practice that I'm still coming across where they want the results exactly as you say, but they also want to be able to live the way they want to live. They want to be able to see their friends when they want to see their friends, pick up and travel and eat. Well, that's great. I want that life for you. I want that life of freedom for you, but you have to put in your time first. Raise a dog that you can leave behind. Raise a dog that can go with you on vacation so that you're going to have this life. But getting there requires a sacrifice of some kind, an effort, an investment. But once the dogs feel that investment, they return it tenfold. It becomes the gift that keeps on giving, as I say. Yeah.
And with reactivity, I know that fear and anxiety can play a role. And I think it can be hard to realize when a dog is fearful versus anxious. And maybe you don't even need to be able to delineate between the two, just understanding they're in a different state of mind. So what's kind of your position on the how fear and anxiety contribute to reactivity?
For sure. Well, they definitely contribute because behind every reactive behavior is at the core a rather anxious dog. I am easy to trigger if I'm anxious to begin with.
Right.
I'm easy to trigger if I'm worried and fearful somewhat and apprehensive to begin with. But let's decipher behavior. And I, as an expert in organizational behavior, we understand the difference between a state and a trait. So am I anxious because that's who I am? Is that a trait of mine that is inherent in my personality? Or is it a state of how I'm feeling in response to a situation?
Right.
And so for sure, anxiety and fear contribute to reactivity. But where is the anxiety and fear coming from? Why is this dog that is otherwise loved, cared for, protected, in someone's home, fed, why is that dog fearful? We need to ask those questions. The answers that we're getting are becoming platitudes, in my opinion. Why is this dog that is so loved more than ever before? We love our dogs more than ever before, if judging by the size of the pet industry, if nothing else.
Right.
How much we spend, how much we think about our dogs, how much we provide our dogs. And yet, why are so many anxious, fearful, and reactive? So all of these contributing factors that we're discussing, yes, they're all legit, but there's the way of life as the ultimate underlying cause. Is this way of life that this dog is living? It is the context. It is the environment. It is the ecosystem of the dog. Essentially, the way I summarize it, everything that we're doing when we're not training with our clickers. What's going on? Where is the dog? Where are they? Who are they with? Are they included? Are they not included? What's going on? How are they being socialized? All those elements that I describe in my method bear such power over a dog's behavior, and yet they are completely overlooked as the root cause of the socialization issues that we're having, the anxiety that is the driving force behind reactivity, but also how way of life, Brittany, either has a moderating force on genetics.
Mm-hmm.
So you were right to say it's not just genetics. I'm saying it's genetics plus way of life.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, nature plus nurture. Simple.
Right.
But we tend to overemphasize nature. This dog and where she came from, and the kill shelter she came from, and where the sob story that we keep talking about in the rescue world, as you know. And I want to shine the light on the way of life we're having right now with this dog and the impact that it's having on their behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And we have control over that way of life in a way that I don't have control over where the dog came from. Or I don't have control over their breed or their particular example of the breed. But I do have control over a way of life.
You pointed out a few interesting pieces there, and something I've learned in the past, I would say year, is a lot of one of my dogs in particular, his anxiousness came from the amount of freedom he had in not understanding my expectations, because I would sometimes let him get away with A, but then the next day I would reprimand him for A. And so for him, and it was also contextual, if I'm going to let him do it in this room, but not this room, at the hotel, but not at home.
Yeah.
So it was the environment that I was creating for him, the expectations that I was.
Yeah. The rules of the game.
Right. The rules were such a free-for-all. He didn't know the rules. He couldn't play by the rules, making him even more anxious.
Exactly.
Making him more reactive.
Meanwhile, if you trace it back to their origins, and I'll be the first to tell you, dogs aren't wolves, wolves aren't dogs, but to deny the genetic legacy is not helping us here. Mm-hmm. So where do dogs come from? They come from animals that live by certain rules. The family operates according to the rearing of the young. The seasons of rearing these young, from cubs to yearlings to full-fledged pack members, follows rules and codes of conduct. So it doesn't have to be militaristic, because sometimes some of my clients say, well, that sounds militaristic. Right. And I'll say it sounds militaristic in comparison to the free-for-all that you've been having. Yeah. But in reality, in the mind of the dog, if you want to see it through your dog's eyes, that structure provides them the safety that is their most important need. There's a lot of talk these days, Brittany, about freedom and choice, that the dog's having the freedom to decide, that agency to decide. And again, if you go to theories of organizational behavior, freedom and agency are not a lower order need. They are a higher order need. A lower order need is safety. It comes first. Mm-hmm. I'm not interested in freedom and choice and agency if I feel fundamentally unsafe in this environment.
Right.
Very good. Yep.
Yeah. Now, if someone's never had a reactive dog, which if you haven't had a reactive dog, it is challenging. It is different, but
it is.
How would you describe to someone how would you be able to identify reactive behavior? If someone is completely new to the topic and they say something like, my dog is acting out. Mm-hmm. Maybe things you would talk to them about or work with them through to be able to identify reactive behavior.
Yeah. Well, actually, that is a great question, because that sheds light on the word reactive and whether it's a helpful word to begin with, because it covers so many scenarios and possibilities. We talked earlier, right? Reactions to sound, reactions around food, which are more possession, which are more, they're explosive, but they're really driven by possessing what is perceived to be a resource. Mm-hmm. So what I would do is to, ask my clients to share the event, share the incident. Where were you? What was going on? What was the aim of your time together? Were you on a walk? Were you entering your building? Were you loading the dog in the car? Were you at your agility class? Where were you? What happened? You get the details of the incident, and then you're better able to find out what it was. And again, reactivity is an umbrella term for many things. So maybe it could be the dog froze. Maybe it could be the dog lunged. Maybe it could be the dog didn't want to go through a threshold and they were barking at the person that was past the threshold. Maybe it was a possessive episode over toys. So once we're better able to understand the details of the situation, we're able to find out what it was. And again, reactivity may or may not be the helpful word in that situation. And like you said earlier, the label may not necessarily matter as much as getting to the root cause of what exactly this behavior is. And again, we tend to really make it a lot more about the dog than about the dog's way of life. So one very powerful teaching of the way of life method is to not put labels on dogs as reactive, as fearful, as anxious, to not make that in their personality, to not make that their trait, and instead to study the situation, learn how to change it in a way that makes a dog feel safe, give time, give this new way of life some time, and then organically the dogs start to not feel so stressed and therefore not be so easy to trigger. Right? So I know we're going to get to that in a moment, but many of the training approaches focus a lot on the trigger and desensitizing dogs to the trigger by building positive associations, shaping a different response, whatever. These interventions have their place, but they also have unanticipated consequences and limitations as well. And they don't account for what I care about, which is, why is it so easy to get this dog triggered? That is my concern, more so than the sound, the dogs, the noises, the toys, the whatever else that could get that dog triggered. I'm more concerned with, why are they so easy to trigger in the first place? And it's almost like the question of what gets them going is not as important.
Right. So we're going to get into training and management strategies, but I had a thought. So we're talking about growling, barking, freezing. Now, I've always heard, and it makes sense, and I want to get your opinion on this. They always say never punish a growl, because a growl is basically like a warning. Now, do you agree with never punish a growl?
Again, with dogs, the situations are so diverse that it's hard for me to say never ever, but definitely the dog is trying to say something. And so I wouldn't punish it. I wouldn't punish it. But let's say, for example, that I have an older dog, one of my older dogs that's a little bit annoyed, let's say with a dog I'm boarding, let's just say hypothetically. And let's say they'll growl. And I know that they know better,
Right.
That they can deal with it quietly and leave. And so I won't punish, but I'll say, hey, because I'll say, this dog here can't really handle your growl just yet. So there are some, but generally, overall, as a rule, if the dog is growling, they're uncomfortable in some form or capacity.
Right.
And so rather than punish it, and I know it can scare, especially a new handler, a new owner, where they might think the growl is a preface to an act of aggression. Meanwhile, it is trying to prevent having to be aggressive. So it's to be dealt with. What is it that's making the dog uncomfortable? Deal with that as opposed to making it about the dog. Try to deal with the environment. Get the dog out. Get the stimulating force out of the situation if at all possible. And deal calmly. That is such an important element, is that we stay calm, is that we stay level. We make it so much worse when we get worried, upset, scared, ashamed, disappointed, whatever else are the feelings that run through our system when we are dealing with a reactive dog. And again, that can come with experience and coaching and getting the right kind of trainer that's not just telling you how to train your dog, but also telling you how to carry yourself, how to carry your body, how to carry your mind, how to talk to your dog when they're reacting. To not yell, to not be afraid. All that matters so much, because the dog is not just reacting, they're also feeling you.
Yeah.
in that moment as to how you're dealing. And so I'll tell my clients, because their manner of handling is so important to reactivity, not just your way of life, but how are you handling that reactive moment, is to handle physically, as in walking away, moving away, keeping the dog steady, whatever the physical handle looks like. But mentally, my attitude says, I don't know what you're talking about. I've not seen a thing.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, in my approach to socialization, one of the levels of socialization is distal socialization, ignoring things at a distance. So all I'm telling my dog is, you do not need to be friendly with all those people. You do not need to like anybody. You simply need to ignore.
Mm-hmm.
The same way that I'm ignoring everything. I don't know what you're talking about. I've not seen anything.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing worth acknowledging. And with time, they read your reactions. How are you taking on the world? Because they're also taking their guidance from you on some level.
Now let's kind of get into those training techniques and strategies and desensitize. Ooh, that's going to be hard to say this evening.
Desensitization. Yes.
So kind of walk us through maybe some advice or tips or exercises. And maybe this is for someone who they're not quite ready to seek out a trainer. Maybe financially they can't seek out a trainer, whatever the case might be. But maybe just some advice you have on training techniques.
Very good. So this is where, if I may take a moment to express how I do things rather differently than the way the mainstream approach to dog training would deal with reactivity. Mm-hmm. So as I said earlier, overwhelmingly, modern dog training tends to focus on the trigger. Is it other dogs? Let's desensitize this dog to other dogs. Is it people? Let's counter-condition the experience of being around people. So what is perceived to be a negative, let's pair that with positive experiences, positive offerings, positive activities that over time should reduce the negative association between seeing people and turning it into a positive association. Mm-hmm. So positive reinforcement absolutely has its place in living with dogs, in training dogs, in raising dogs. Mm-hmm. But the point that I make in my book and in my method and in my overall coaching approach is that reactivity ultimately, Brittany, is not just a matter of a skill in how a dog responds to the world, because you can train for a skill, but it's about the attitude that they have. Yeah. What's their attitude in the world? Are they nervous and reactive, or are they happy-go-lucky? That is an attitude, not just a skill. Like, leave it, look at me, watch me. That is a skill. But to really deal with reactivity and go even beyond dealing with reactivity and actually raising dogs that are sound, that don't react, that don't care to react, that are hard to trigger, that is raising a dog and not training the dog. That is instilled in the way of life. It's in how the dog is raised that they develop that attitude towards the world, right? So, nothing against reinforcement and behavior modification. They have their place, they have their time. Right. But they do not even come close to the power of one's way of life. And that's where we struggle, Brittany, is that we're training dogs while overlooking the way of life, which is the root cause, ultimately, of why they're so easy to trigger. And so to answer the question about someone who's not ready yet to hire a trainer or invest in a trainer, or maybe they don't have the means just yet, I wrote my book in a way that it is almost like a textbook. It's a guide for life. And so anyone, anywhere around the world can order a $25 book and start looking at how their way of life might be helping or hindering their dogs, of how their way of life can potentially make the world of a difference. And those are not things that cost in the same way that hiring a behaviorist or a veterinary behaviorist, because that's the route that many are going these days, is going the medication route, going on long-term medication. expensive medication, expensive veterinary behavior consults. And meanwhile, way of life is accessible, affordable, and it's the daily decisions that you're making that can make a big difference in whether this dog is generally stressed and therefore easy to trigger, or not so stressed and therefore less likely to be triggered.
Do you think there's something to be said for consistent routines
100%.
and structured environments?
Yes. The way of life method, Brittany, does things in stages, roughly equivalent to childhood, teenage, and adulthood. Structured routines, consistent routines, structured environments are extremely important in the beginning, in the childhood stage. But eventually the idea is to loosen up the structure and have dogs that do just fine without structure because they have now matured to a level that they do not need it in the same way that a child does. So the structure is important, but it's not something that technically you should be enforcing or ensuring forever and ever and ever.
Right.
I also have older dogs. They are 8, 9, 12, and 15. And we do not have the consistency that we once did when they were younger, or the consistency that my clients' dogs get when they're boarding with me or doing a board and train with me, or the consistency that I ask people just getting started with the method, in other words, at stage 1, to establish that consistency and then eventually work their way out of it, because now they have a dog that is self-regulated, mature, because that is my definition of the opposite of reactive. Mature, calm, takes in the world, thinks about it. The opposite of reactive is thoughtful. So what is it that our dogs are lacking that is making them not thoughtful? When in fact they're so capable of being thoughtful, being such highly intelligent creatures. And that again comes in our way of life, that there are things that we can do in our way of life to promote our dog's capacity to think and take on the world and not be stressed by it and reactive to it.
Yeah. Now let's go back to training. So when do you think is a good time to seek professional help? And obviously some people, they get a puppy, they start training, and that's great. But let's say I just rescued a dog, or let's say my dog's behavior has changed, whether I'm seeing him a little bit more reactive, when people ride their bicycle past or something like that. So can you think of a situation that might trigger someone to start seeking professional help, maybe looking for someone who specializes in, it might be a behaviorist or something to that effect? So any advice on when people should start kind of seeking out professional help?
So I would say as soon as possible. Immediately, quickly. Don't wait. Because what tends to happen is that people think for some reason, and that is an issue that is recognized in the industry, is the general reluctance to seek professional help. There's the idea that, well, I should know. How hard can it be?
Right.
It's just a dog. How hard can it be? I should know. Or I'll watch a few videos on YouTube and that should tide me over.
Yeah.
No. Seek help before the dog does something that could make you now rethink your entire relationship. Because there's a saying in dog training is that by the time people seek help, things would have gone so bad that they would have considered rehoming their dogs. We don't want to get into that point where there's almost a dislike of the dog. There's almost a feeling that you won't be able to fix it. So hire a professional quickly. But with that said, again, as someone who doesn't do things the way everybody else does, I have to say that with a little bit of a reservation, because again, the way most trainers will deal with, let's say, a reactivity to sounds is through behavior modification, trying to change the dog's response to sound and to a particular sound, as opposed to asking, why is this dog so sensitive? Why are they so sensitized to sounds? Okay. If I have time for a quick example here, a client with a cockapoo, they're known to be sound sensitive. And that was a household with young babies. So there's microwave bings going, there's oven sounds going. There's all sorts of household appliances that are going, and this dog reacting to sounds. Well, they thought that that's what it was. Reactivity to sounds. That's the diagnosis. Let's get someone to help us. They get a behaviorist who tried to change her feelings around the sounds and give her treats when they happened. Well, guess what happened? Now the sounds became even more important to her.
Mm-hmm.
They took on even more meaning. But when I came in, when they were desperate finally, and they were open to a different way of doing things, and we started to rejig her way of life, the level of freedom, for example, which you so rightfully pointed to. This dog was around all the time, around the young kids all the time. Not a moment to rest, not a moment to herself. Always in the house with everyone, not getting the right amount of exercise. So once we did the way of life audit, and we could see all the ways in which that way of life could be improved, plus a little bit of time, and now we had a dog that maybe was a little bothered sometimes by the noises, but not to the point of reactivity now. There's a big difference between reactivity and anxiety around a noise versus being, hey, I'm not a fan of this.
Right.
Right? So, so yes, get help, but understand the kind of help that you're getting, because the other side of this, Brittany, that is concerning is that there's positive reinforcement trainers and then there's so-called balance trainers. So we're having situations where there's punishment that is being used. There's correction that is being used. There are tools like e-collars and remotes and prong collars and choke chains and head halters. Tools are being used. And I don't care what tool it is, but tools are being used in a way that causes discomfort at a minimum, or else the tool would not be doing anything if it didn't cause some amount of discomfort. Mm-hmm. And again, all of these approaches say the problem is with the dog. It's the dog that needs training, that needs handling, that needs disciplining. I'm saying, let's look at the way of life first. Mm-hmm. Give it some time and then see what happens. See whether the issue was really in the dog to begin with. And it's very powerful because it's actually a lot more rich and actually fun in many ways to be conscious about how you're living than it is trying to train a dog out of a behavior. And it's a lot kinder to the dog because it doesn't assume that it's the dog that's the issue. It assumes that the issue is with how this way of life is organized for where I'm at in my relationship with my dog. Mm-hmm. So if I'm starting off from a reactive dog with a reactive situation, by definition, my relationship is tense, it's not strong. So things need to be done a certain way. For example, don't cut the dog loose on the beach with 10 other dogs when you have issues with this dog.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
You have a dog at stage 2 or stage 3, as I describe in my method. Yes, start experimenting with being off leash responsibly, being around dogs the dog may not know. So there's a time and place to be doing things, but we want it all now. We want it all quickly. We want it with the dog we just brought home.
I think this idea of wanting things now and wanting things immediately, it's perpetuated daily in everything that we do. But
yes,
especially with a lot of these movies that have dogs in them and the dogs are so well trained. I mean, we've seen the movies with the police dogs and everyone went and got a Belgian Malinois and then realized, oh, wow, they don't come pre-trained and they're very difficult to work with. So I think that's a huge piece of this as well, is this idea that, your dog will come home perfectly. A single session, your dog will be the exact dog you're wanting and expecting. Goes back to those expectations that we talked about.
Exactly. And meanwhile, if you're rational about your expectations, the dog can really feel it.
Yeah.
Because here's a tidbit. Anxiety, ultimately, what is it? Ultimately, at the core, I feel anxious and dogs are feeling anxious because we feel there are expectations put on us that we're not sure we can deliver. And so we've put all these expectations on dogs of good behavior, of social behavior, of tolerant behavior without the benefit of relationship first, of well-behaved behavior without the benefit of training first. expectations, anxiety, and therefore reactivity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Tell everyone where they can find you and your book, if anyone wants to pick up your book or find you on social media.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much. So best place to go is my website, wayoflifedogtraining, one word.com. Under resources, you can find any resource related to the method, whether it's the blog, the book, free resources, the newsletter archive. It's all there under resources. And then on social, you can find us on YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram under Way of Life Dog Training or Way of Life Dog Training Academy.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us today and helping us navigate the complicated world of reactive dogs. Maybe we won't even label them all as reactive. Maybe that's
correct.
Appropriate.
That's it.
We appreciate you coming on.
Thank you so much for having me. This was great.
Thank you for tuning in to the Canine Culture Podcast. Please make sure you subscribe to the Canine Culture Podcast on your favorite podcast platform and make sure you're following us on social media. If you have any recommendations, any topics that you'd like to hear, if you know of any guests that would be good for the show, or if you yourself want to be a guest, please reach out to us. Send us an email at canineculturepodcast@gmail.com or send us a direct message on social media. Thank you for listening, and please share this with any of your dog-loving friends.